Space, the final frontier.
Welcome to IAYTD, and today we're looking at the huge franchise known as Star Trek. We'll cover movies and television and hopefully give you insight into why people love this franchise. It is going to be a superficial look, but hopefully ideal for people with very minimal Star Trek knowledge. The year was 1964. A man by the name of Gene Roddenberry proposed a television series to Desilu Productions, which is a studio co-owned by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. They pitched a show to NBC, and they created a pilot to Star Trek, with a man by the name of Christopher Pike as the captain of the ship. This pilot wasn't exactly beloved, but the concept worked, so they actually made a second pilot, replacing Pike with a new captain, James T. Kirk, played by William Shatner. They replaced most of the other cast members as well. This series, which would later become known as Star Trek the Original Series, aired for 3 seasons. Roddenberry created this world to showcase what he thought our future was capable of. He created a species called the Vulcans, highlighted by the main character Spock, which had transcended violence, and they created a culture of peace. Maybe transcended violence is the wrong phrasing. They've chosen logic and rationality over emotion, which usually cuts out violence unless violence is the rational choice. Gene Roddenberry insisted on a diverse cast from all sorts of backgrounds and identities, and back in the 60s this wasn't a popular idea, but he was very insistent. He also wanted each episode to have a sense of adventure, but also to have a lesson or a debate about morality. All of these adventures focused around one ship, the Starship Enterprise. They were sent by the Federation, which is basically a governing body like a multi-planet United Nations, and they were sent via the exploration arm of the Federation called Starfleet. This is much more complicated and nuanced than that, but again, this is a superficial explanation. Now, after its 3 seasons, the show was over. Paramount Studios bought the rights from Desilu and started to syndicate the show, meaning it would air repeatedly on multiple channels daily. It already had a fan base, but the syndication started to rally more and more fans. Star Trek conventions even started to pop up. Letter writing campaigns convinced Paramount that something might be left in this franchise, and then they began to work on feature films. Eventually, 6 movies would come out starring this original cast. After the first film, Paramount pushed Roddenberry out of creative control, under the pretense that the first film, while profitable, was still underwhelming. Now that it was clear that Star Trek was popular again, Paramount gave it another shot at television with a new spin-off, Star Trek: The Next Generation. This one swapped out a whole new cast, and it took place about 100 years in the future from the original series. This series lasted 7 seasons and was led by Patrick Stewart as the new captain, Jean-Luc Picard. As with the original series, this was a diverse group, and the leap in makeup and prosthetics available meant that some major starring roles were now dedicated to alien races, such as the Klingon Worf. People immediately gravitated to this show, and they embraced the mythology, including people who would go so far as to study and learn the Klingon language. 4 more movies would be released which would focus on this new cast, including one that would bridge the gap between casts called Generations, basically passing on the baton to a new set of actors and actresses. Following The Next Generation, we got a 3rd series called Deep Space Nine, which featured Captain Benjamin Sisko, played by Avery Brooks. This series took a few detours from the original structure of the first 2 series, focusing on one single destination, the literal station called Deep Space Nine, which is near a wormhole, making it a strategic location for occupation. The series focused on more serialized stories that lasted many episodes, as opposed to one-off stories, and it dove into deeper stories that were potentially more controversial. It was during this series that Gene Roddenberry passed away at the age of 70. Up next, we got a series called Star Trek Voyager, featuring Captain Kathryn Janeway, played by Kate Mulgrew, who interestingly enough is now starring on Orange is the New Black. This series lasted 7 seasons and focused on the ship called Voyager, which is used to travel through the wormhole that's near Deep Space Nine. But once they're there, the ship is damaged and they must travel back home the long way, about a 75-year journey. Since they're stranded, this crew is made up of some former enemies and suspicious characters, all brought together by the need for survival. Finally, we have the most recent Star Trek series, Enterprise. This series starred Scott Bakula as Captain Jonathan Archer, and this was actually a prequel to everything we've seen so far, exploring some of the first adventures into space, even before the Federation was created. The series was initially well received, but ratings declined and it was eventually cancelled after 4 seasons. This cancellation meant that for the first time in 18 years there would be no new Star Trek episodes on television. This was in 2005. Something interesting then happened. Everything before this, all of these shows and movies had been part of one world, they were all connected. But then we saw a reboot happening, a new movie simply titled Star Trek under the direction of J.J. Abrams, who brought you shows like Felicity, Alias, and Lost before this. His only movie before this was Mission Impossible 3. When the movie eventually came out, all concerns were laid to rest and the movie was generally seen as a success, both critically and commercially. There are 3 movies in this new trilogy, including Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond. While I referred to these as reboots, it's a little more complicated than that. I won't go into it much, but after watching the first new Star Trek movie, you'll notice ways that it connects to the previous television shows. These new films are headlined by Chris Pine as Captain James Kirk and Zachary Quinto as Spock. There's also a new television series slated for 2017 called Discovery, and it's presumed that it will connect to the massive mythology already created as opposed to the new film continuity. In most of my What Is videos, I try to give you some examples of what sort of impact these shows have had. On a superficial level, we've got notable quotes and phrases like,
"Live long and prosper,"
and
"I'm a doctor, not a coal miner. I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer. I'm a doctor, not an engineer. I'm a doctor, not an escalator. Spock, give me a hand."
On a much bigger scale though, Star Trek actually inspired innovation such as cell phones and tablets. The show featured mapping technology for planets that would eventually inspire Google Earth. We're all just now anxiously waiting for teleportation technology to come to fruition. So those are the basics of Star Trek on a very, very superficial level. If you're new to this, watching the original series is the best place to start, and then you work your way through the television shows. If one of the shows sounded more interesting than the others, you could likely get away with starting in the middle, for example, just diving straight into Deep Space Nine. You might miss some references, but it wouldn't be too difficult. You could also just watch the 3 new Star Trek movies without knowing any of the old canon. Hopefully this was helpful and interesting. Thanks for watching.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.